Welcome to the Unstuck and Happy podcast. We all get stuck, but how long you stay there is up to you. I'm your host, John Polish, founder of the Unstuck Happiness Conference. And this is the show where we interview people who've overcome tremendous adversity and have emerged as leaders. So if you need a little inspiration and hope in your day, get ready, because here comes another great Unstuck story. Well, there is a lot going on in the world today, a lot of chaos and rioting in the streets and all kinds of interesting things. And we have a wonderful guest today to give us a little bit of perspective. She's seen quite a bit of that in her life. And I want to welcome today Dr. R Jacobson.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me here. And I love that startup music. It just kind of sets the tone for the happy day.
It does. It's pretty cool. Tell me a little bit about you. How did you get to be an advocate for the type of leadership that you do today, which we'll get into in just a little bit, but just tell us kind of how you got here.
A lot of it really comes from my background. When I was 6 years old, my family upped and moved from New York to Israel. My mom was born originally in Jerusalem and spent years here. After she came to the U.S. During Israeli Independence War, and in the 70s we kind of upped the entire family and moved to Israel. And having grown up there, I spent 15 years there, 2 wars, terror attacks. And so the aspect of a lot of my skills, a lot of my upbringing, a lot of my foundation came from living in a foreign country and experiencing a very different lifestyle. And I will say that with the influences that were in my life at the time, I still had, my grandfather was alive for several years, and he was an icon in some of the Israeli history. I had the opportunity to absorb and learn from some very powerful people that left strong impression on me.
That's awesome. So you actually had a lot of things going on there. Not only were you living in a war zone basically, but it was essentially a foreign land to you.
Yes, it was. Not only that, I always talk about the fact that I moved there when I was in kindergarten. And while I was in the States and in kindergarten, we started learning how to read and write. I got there and I literally have no memory of my second half year in kindergarten, because it was a foreign country, new kids, new habits, new customs, new language, and I couldn't speak it. So there's kind of like a bit of a gap until I later on learned the language and could start communicating. By the same token, that was also an experience that was pivotal for me, because it forced me to learn how to connect with people on a different level.
Very interesting. So what was that? How did you connect with them?
So I started, Israel, especially at the time, was a major, and it still is, but a major melting pot. And I really first was forced to start looking and connecting with people, not just on the language level, but really watching people's behavior, understanding and connecting also with body language and being able to read certain things. And then later on, being able to learn multiple languages and understand different cultures, different behaviors, so that I can feel comfortable and embrace more of that variety and of the differences and really look for commonalities. And I think that in my life, that's something that created the pattern of always looking to find someone new and find what I have in common with them as opposed to what we have different.
And how appropriate is that with the times that we find ourselves in today, the rioting in the streets and all these things that are because of our differences. And I've done a lot of, corporate training as well. And it's interesting how often, especially in management, people they see something that's different and they're threatened by it. And body language in particular is something that I've spoke a lot about, because it's interesting to me. If somebody tells me to read body language, personally, I don't care what your body language is. What I'm watching for are changes in it. Is there a sudden change in your posture? Because usually it denotes a change in your emotional state. So did I just say or do something that caused you to shift emotionally and then shift physically as well?
Yes, and emotions and posture are directly connected. I mean, one of the techniques, as someone who is proficient in neurolinguistic programming, we talk about the fact that my state can determine my emotions, and my physicality are directly connected. So if I want to change my state, I can change my physiology. If I want to change my physiology, I can change my state. When you look at something simple, you look at Dr. Amy Cuddy's work, and when she talks about power poses, how just making a change in the pose will change people's feelings and people's emotion. When you study animals, you look at animals when especially with alpha dogs, when they puff up their chest and they come, you'll see that there's a change in their emotion and their behavior. So I became very sensitive to being able to watch people and how they are relating, and also know that something that might have been said puts somebody on guard or causes them to lean in. So being able to read those things has allowed me to be able to connect with people on a different level. As a matter of fact, when I talk about, we talked about the corporate training, when I work with companies, the theme that I always bring in when I do long-term programs is the fact that our commonalities unite, our differences divide, focus on commonalities. And that's a thread through all of my work.
Absolutely. And, it's tough when there are differences and we don't understand them. And when I talked about this shifting of your body language and shifting your emotions, I literally I thought I was the only one talking about this. Somebody came up to me afterwards and told me that he was he was a warden, a guard in a high security prison. And the first thing that he was taught was pay no attention to the way that someone's standing, but watch when they shift. He's like, a lot of these gang members stand in a way that you would think is offensive, but it's not. It's just natural to them. But when they shift quickly, watch them.
Right. And one of the things that I do when I do, especially when I do some of the communication courses, I talk about some of those things specifically. We always think about somebody who stands there and, oh, well, if your arms are crossed, you're really closing down. Well, you take a guy who's really big and has a barrel chest, or is a heavy weightlifter, and they've got heavy, really very defined lats. Standing with your arms by your side is not physically comfortable. The most comfortable position is going to be having their arms crossed, laying on their own chest. But if all of a sudden you're saying they're standing like there and they're just calm like that, but all of a sudden there's a lean in or there's a shift, those are the things that something triggered them and they are about to react.
Absolutely.
And that's going to be the difference between a response and a reaction. So those are things to pay attention to.
And those folded arms could just mean they're cold. It could mean that maybe they were closed off as a child and got used to that, and that's how they're comfortable. Could mean a bunch of different things. But when they shift suddenly, I'm now watching to see if other things like breathing patterns and eye rolling and things like that go along with it to let me know.
Right, to really get, and that's the key thing. It's in any situation that you want to get the full information of what exactly is happening, because of the fact that just watching certain things or paying attention to one thing can create in our mind some unconscious bias, because we're used to putting things and people and systems into little boxes.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I talk about not doing. I said the only time I get put in the box is if I'm going 6 feet under, and I don't plan on doing that for a while.
Right. So tell me what it was like growing up over there, seeing wars. How old were you when war broke out?
The first war that I really remember very vividly was the '73 war. I was living in Haifa, and it was High Holy Days. It was Yom Kippur, which is the Atonement Day in the Jewish religion. And as a kid, we went to school. In our school, we had a makeshift temple, so it was just kind of the community. And I don't come from a religious family, but as a kid, we went down there, and my neighbor and my sister and we went down to the temple, and it was just before 2 o'clock. We decided to go home. And I always talk about the fact that we were about 3/4 of a mile from the school, and it was uphill both directions. But it really was uphill on the way back home from the school. And we get about a third of the way, and there is this shrieking siren. Because during the high holy days, especially Yom Kippur, there are no vehicles in the street. There's no public transportation, private transportation, so it's very, very quiet. And you hear this loud siren. I had my younger sister, who was, I think I was like fourth grade. She was second grade. And then a neighbor who was a couple of years older. And we look and like, what do we do? And during that time, there were very few homes along the way. And somebody from out of the window said, like, where, where are you going? I said, well, we're on our way home. Good. No, 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 no. Go back to the school because there's a shelter there. So we run back to the school. And when we get to the school into the temple, everybody's like there's this commotion and everybody's stirred up. And they ask us where our parents are. I said, well, our parents are not here because we came on our own. Oh, no, 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 no. You have to go to your parents. So just imagine this picture. I've got my 7-year-old kid sister. I'm like 9 years old, an 11-year-old, and we're running uphill. I'm dragging my kid sister with me, and we're frantic because we have no idea what is happening. And when we finally get to the building, my mom was waiting there. There's no cell phones. There's no way to get in touch with us. So she just is wondering what is going on. So she waited there, and they brought us down to the bomb shelter. And I think we had about 25 families. We're all sitting in this concrete bomb shelter with those little old transistor radios that are like, and trying to figure out what's going on. And then, of course, we hear that there is a war. And we had the adults were sitting in one room. They had folding chairs. All the kids were sitting in a circle on the floor and started playing card games and other things. And that was our life for several days. I know it was on and off. I do remember also with all the announcements, I remember the code calls that they were calling in the reserves, and each unit has its own code call. I remember those on the radio. I remember looking up north. I lived in Haifa, and we could see the trail of military vehicles heading up north towards Lebanon and then further up into Syria. And that was really the extent of it. So I'm watching adults. So I'm watching from the point of view of a kid, and I'm watching the adults, and I'm watching adult reaction or response. Those that were calmer, that kind of were able to take control, and those that were very reactive, dramatic, and panicking because nobody knew what was going on. And that was really the first time that I encountered something where I could see the fear, I could see the panic, and I'm just trying to observe and figure out how to behave. And I know for me on a personal level, it started where there was a major shift because I remember my question as a kid, and the question at the time was, okay, I just came from temple, and how can God create war on the holiest day for the Jews? And that's a question of a 9-year-old. It's not a question of somebody who knows that God does not create those people, have free will and choice. But it was something that was very defining. And by the same token, watching people go to war, watching the country unite, was something that created with us as kids a lot of pride. And that was really the time when I decided I was going to be a commander in the Army.
Wow. It sounds too like a lot of that observing the emotions, even back at 9 years old, led to a lot of what you do today.
And, the reason why this is so powerful because I will tell you, I had a moment this past week where, as a result of the events that are happening now, we had very a very tumultuous. We had riots in Scottsdale. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we had riots 10 minutes from my home.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a lot of, throughout the years, I had done a lot of personal work to really recover from the traumas and the stresses of growing up in a war-torn country. And what has happened in our country in the past week or 10 days hit me at a core level that brought up some of those emotions from my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's okay. I've learned how to manage my emotions. I've learned techniques that I've implemented, but I still had to do the work.
Absolutely. That, this is a big part of what I teach, is that we think of emotions as fleeting, like they come and they go. But what happens is all of our experiences get wrapped up in emotions, and we hold on to them. We use them later as experience filters. So when something happens that reminds us of our past, that emotion from the past resurfaces. So yeah, I'm not surprised that all these years later, seeing rioting in the streets could bring you kind of back into that moment. And it's a good thing you had been kind of working on yourself and processing, so it didn't lead to, essentially that could be like PTSD or something traumatic if you don't deal with it.
Absolutely. And the thing is that I will say that as a kid, I likely had PTSD. We just didn't term it as such.
Mm-hmm.
But by the same token, I learned certain tools. One of the things that I do pride myself on, because I've been through many different challenges and other adversity aside from war. And one of the things that I've actually learned is to actually find that calm in the center of a storm and activate myself and my skills in a different fashion, that when there is a condition, whether it's adversity, whether there's trauma or tragedy, I actually become very still, become very quiet. And from that, I move away from reaction and into action. And it's action that comes more from a place of logic and not of a place of emotion. So it's responding versus reacting.
Right.
One of the things that even when you look, something simple, when you look at conversations, that people have on social media, and I'm watching, and I observe certain things, and I just sit back and watch, and I'm watching people become reactive based on what somebody says, and then throwing darts back, and I might post something and I'll say, well, it's like, I don't get into emotional conversations, because to me that's actually not a way to have a discussion. That's an opinion, and every single one of us is entitled to an opinion, but I look at facts.
Right.
Because facts are indisputable. Fact is, I live here on planet Earth. Fact is, I'm a certain way, and fact is, other people are different. I can choose to like it or dislike it. That's where opinions and beliefs come in. I choose to really look at people first and foremost as human beings, and not as human doings. What we do is a result of who we are, but what are my values? How do I embrace and look at other people? And then how do I act from it?
I just had an interesting thought come to mind while you were saying that. And that's like, when we're in the middle of something that's really traumatic, that's potentially dangerous, like in the middle of a war zone, or in the middle of a great tragedy, you don't really stop and think about opinion at that point. And there's a calm, like you'd mentioned. I think we're very resilient people. And when we have to be, we step up to that. When we find ourselves reacting, you probably know that it's not as urgent and immediate, just because of the fact that we're reacting that way. Because if something is urgent and immediate and we're in great danger, we're really usually not worried about somebody else's opinion.
And again, I think that's also though how we take it as individuals. is when, as someone with, when we look at emotional intelligence and we talk about amygdala hijack, which basically means that I go into drama and I go into fight or flight, that's when somebody becomes reactive. That's when somebody will do something without thinking. There are situations, especially when it comes to life or death, these like amazing stories about a parent who lifted a car and they have no idea how they did that. They wouldn't be able to do that under regular circumstances. That is where that instinct, that human drive comes in. When we look at some other reactions where people have had opportunity to process, that's where some of the ugliness comes out.
Yes, and that's where a lot of the work that happens afterwards comes in. So I've been through tragedy myself. I work with people who've had tragedy. One of the groups I've been working with a lot lately are people that were at the concert in Vegas where the shooting occurred. So I've been working very closely with that group. And when something like that happens, you hear the heroic stories. Everybody moves into action, everything's fine. But then it's when you get home and you're sitting alone in the quiet and you have the opportunity to think, that you start coming up with all of these questions. Why did this have to happen? How would somebody do this? And the drama eventually ensues from all of that questioning.
And the challenge in that is those are questions that, I hate to say it, you really have, there's no point in asking them. Unless you ask the individual themselves why they did what they did, and they may or not be able to tell you. But the question of why it happened, why me, why did they do this, that actually takes away our power. The questions, the better questions, even in a situation after, okay, I've been through this. What can I do to bring back a state of norm into my life? Because the questions about why it happened is actually what leaves you in the unstuck, in the stuck position, because you end up repeating, and it's like that hamster wheel. I'm going to keep on running and running and running and repeating and asking a question that there is no way that I can actually find an answer to. So I'm stuck in an emotional lockup.
Absolutely. 100% agree with you. And sometimes there is an answer, but even that answer still doesn't serve me. So instead of asking why me, literally asking what can I do with this? How can I use this to help myself or others later on? And that's the phase 2 of the processing. Yeah. After they've sat in their emotion for a little bit, because they have to have permission to feel, for sure. But then when you come out of it, start asking, okay, what can I do with this? How do I find purpose and meaning in all of it? Because you were there for a reason. It's happened to you for some reason.
Absolutely. One of the things that I do, and I've been working lately with companies on how to move past some of the emotional stress, how to be in your language, how to be unstuck. And I talk about accept, adapt, advance. There's 3 phases on how we need to relate to this. And the first one is, you want to equate it to the serenity prayer. You got to accept the things that you cannot change. If something happened, you cannot make it unhappen. It's there, it happened. Trying to resist it is actually creating more turmoil. So just accept it as it is, and then find your calm, find your place, so where you either have to adapt to your circumstances or adapt your emotions to where you are. And when you can move away from that reactive place, now you can actually step back and take a look. You take a look and you assess the situation. When you can take a look and assess the situation, you'll find that answers come up that you have not seen before, because of the fact that logic and emotion will not coexist. So if you can remove the emotion, you have the ability to move into a place of logic and see answers and opportunities that you have not seen before, so that you can adjust, navigate, and move forward.
I love this. We are very much on the same page here. One of my taglines is that cognitive solutions don't fix emotional problems. And so one of the reasons you might know what to do, but one of the reasons it's not working for you is because of the emotional attachments we have to our past that are holding us back. We have to work through that first. And I love visuals. So I'm very visual, even in presenting. And I did this with a group recently that experienced tragedy. Very simple, but I took a plate and poured some water on the plate, talked about their education, their experience, their emotional intelligence. And we poured a little bit of pepper on the plate and said, there's a little picture like your happiness at the bottom of that plate. Okay, you have some experiences that are kind of clouding that. And then we had this tragedy. We dumped a whole bunch of pepper on the plate in the middle. So now this tragedy's happened. Now it's really clouding your vision. Like, reach in there and remove just the pepper from the last tragedy. Of course you can't, because it's all in water. It just keeps moving back, but they'll keep trying. Like, the problem is, we're focusing so much on the problem, but it's already happened. It's already here. It's already part of who you are. And instead of focusing on that, why don't we work on ourselves for a while? And then just had them take their finger and dip it in some dish soap and put it on the plate. And then suddenly all the pepper shoots to the outside of the plate and you can see the bottom again. Well, it hasn't gone away. It's just not holding you back anymore because you're looking at things differently. You've worked on your own perspective rather than trying to change the past.
Absolutely. And when I work, I actually took this course when I was in your town in Vegas with Tad James' company, when I took timeline therapy, got certified in timeline therapy. And timeline therapy actually will work to help people remove that attachment to the chain of events, to the trauma drama. One of the things in that is, in order for us as human beings to filter what happens in our life and make sense, we do create these files in our subconscious mind. And we catalog things in the files. And I talk about the fact that, especially the big ones, the traumas, the pain from, the hurt, the shame, the guilt, the fear, the anger, those are the big ones, the heavy ones. And we do know that emotionally, because that's part of old primitive brain fight or flight of our limbic system, that those emotions really have strong anchors. So I equate it to the fact that you have an anchor that's holding your ship and preventing you from sailing forward. And what happens is, each time there's another event, there's another link in the chain. And in order to be able to sail forward, you have to go back and remove that anchor from the ground, and then it dissipates everything. So when I've worked, either whether I do executive coaching or when in the past I used to do more of the individual, like personal development, as opposed to now I'm really focused on the business side and professional development. But I used to do a lot more timeline therapy and help people relieve some of those emotions so that they can stop being reactive and tying everything to the past. And that's, in a way, that's also a technique that's used with PTS, because what happens is that's where they get stuck, in that emotion and that record that plays again and again and again and again and again.
Absolutely. And one of my fears, especially with what we're going through in society today, is, for years, my catchphrase was, I got to get things back to normal. Well, normal's gone.
There is no normal.
Right.
Not only there is no normal, and this is without getting, heading into what really might be happening, but with all the different changes and things that are being brought in, I think the important thing, and you used the word earlier on because you talked about resilience. I think the word of the day and what's important for us to do is to not only help people move from the fear, because we have so much fear in society, and it's not just from the current last few months, but it has been for several years. I've been watching, again, I observe trends, and there's been more and more fear inbred into people over the past several years. What I look at is, how do I help? And my job, my mission, how do I help people become not only more resilient, but more adaptable? Being able to cope with their circumstances and be able to be more flexible in how they relate to things, and so that they not only they're not stuck, but they can actually live a daily basis in existence that is not frantic and that is not paralyzing.
Yeah. And in my terminology, same thing. If you're not getting what you want, you can sit there and look at it and complain, or you can pivot and keep moving. And adapt. So back to your story, how did you manage to become resilient and adapt after living in war zone, essentially?
It took a lot of years, a lot of therapy. I will be, totally honest. Um, I had done years of, and it's not traditional stuff, quite frankly, because I've never been one that follows the traditional route. I've done a tremendous amount of personal development and mindset and personal growth. Anything from doing work years ago with Louise Hay's work, You Can Heal Your Life. That was probably one of the first books that was very significant for me, to Walking on Fire and doing the fire walk with Tony Robbins. Um, it was more about understanding some of the greats that talked about the fact that what our mind can conceive, our mind can achieve, and really understanding the connection between our mindset and the human spirit. I also have been, very lucky that regardless of the stresses that I grew up with, war and growing up under those conditions in Israel, my leadership skills came from my heritage. My learning, my discipline came from my heritage. My grandfather was the head in 1939. He was the head of something called the Haganah, which is the defense, and that was what was preceded the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. He's probably the only human being in my entire life that I ever had on a pedestal. And I just looked at the things that he achieved, and he taught me discipline. He taught me how to learn. He taught me how to achieve. He taught me never to quit. And those are things that I took with me. And even at the lowest times in my life, I always found a way, like, let's flip it. Let's flip it. Look at the bright side. What can I see in there? Where is a point of light that I can find and hang on to, that I can move towards?
Absolutely. And I love too that you mentioned that it took therapy, because I think one of the benefits of, one of the reasons we do what we do is to offer a shortcut to people who, don't have years of therapy or don't have the years to waste. We've been through it, we've experienced it, and we just want to be a kind of a light to help people get through things. So.
Well, and that's why I said it, even the stuff that I did was non-traditional, because I can tell you that I remember when I was in the army in Israel, and I had a situation where I was definitely in crisis, and that was when I was sick. When I actually, for 4 years, I was in and out of hospitals. I was diagnosed at 17 with systemic lupus, and they were ready to shut the book on me. And when I was in the army, there was I had a commander who, she was a bully, flat out. She was a bully, and I literally remember the time when I stood up to her and said no, knowing, quite frankly, that I would be court-martialed. But it was a shift and a point in my life where I was not willing to take any of the abuse anymore. But that was also a time when and that came around the time when I ended up saying, you know what, I think I need to go talk to somebody. And I remember because I was part of military intelligence, so they send you to special units. You don't do the traditional stuff because you got clearances and it's not supposed to be on your record. So they sent me to a civilian, and she started getting into Freudian psychology, and I was like, see ya. I'm not going to do that. I have always gone towards things that will have really a quick change, because I believe personally that, change is going to happen like this. Having to get to it comes from our readiness. I was in the army, and things were very stressful. I smoked. And here I was, I had lupus, I had asthma, and I was smoking cigarettes. Can you say dumb? And when I got out of and it wasn't for very long, but it was a coping mechanism. It was a coping mechanism for stress. And it was only later on that I really realized it, because it wasn't because of peer pressure, because everybody was doing it. It was because, believe it or not, I would sit there and stare at the smoke, and it would bring some calm onto me. Pollute my lungs, but nonetheless.
Right.
And I literally, when I moved back to the States, I moved back to the States a week after I got out of the Army. And I was in Manhattan sitting at a diner with a friend, and she said, I think I'm going to stop smoking. I said, I'll join you. Put the box on the table, never touched a cigarette ever again in my life.
Nice.
And that was there was a point in my life where I was smoking a pack and a half a day. So this is not like the occasional cigarette, but it does come to mindset, and it does come to decision. And respectfully, I also know that not everybody has that same level of conviction.
Right.
And that's okay. And that's what makes us different and unique. And all I'm here to do is to support the people when they do want to make changes and do want to transform, is guide them along the way.
So what are you doing now? How do you help and support?
I have as I'm a professional speaker, and now that we are sitting at home waving to people because we cannot be in large gatherings, I have shifted all my platforms to virtual. So I'm actually a certified virtual presenter, and all my programs, I'm working more on some of the consulting and training side. I just had a client today that I spoke to, being able to design specific programs in areas of leadership, emotional intelligence, and communication, being able to work and build high performance teams. Now that's really where I'm focused right now, and it can be anything from helping them with their vision and facilitating strategic planning events, to leadership grooming and emotional intelligence training, assessing talent, etc.
Any specific groups that you're working with, or?
I work a lot. I work really well with people that were kind of left brain. In the past, they might have been like me. I was a math major, math and science. And so I too can talk tech, but I also teach tech how to talk human. In other words, I've done events with Society of Information Management, with technology, with healthcare. I've got some in I don't know how I ended up on these guys, but I've had a number of like land survey companies, which also has a lot of the technical side. City, as a woman-owned business, I'm certified, a certified vendor for the city of Phoenix and Tempe. So I do work with them as well, and finance companies. I do a lot of finance companies, whether it's places like BMO Harris, or an international company out of Canada that I just worked with in January. I had the privilege of doing a really fun tour of 6 keynotes in Canada just before we shut down, and actually seeing on the Canadian side what COVID-19 started looking like when people started opening up, and people from the Far East were in Canada with the masks, and we didn't even know what was going on yet.
Right. Awesome. So how can we find you?
I am on social. I have, and everything is branded as Dr. Karen Jacobson with an SON. So we've got, of course, the website, which, by the way, we're coming up with a brand new website in a couple of weeks. And there's some different assessments on there, a lot of free stuff that I'm offering, as well as a free ebook for people who want to just look at how to be effective, high-performing leaders. And then, the regular, the LinkedIn and the Facebook and the Twitter and Instagram and YouTube channel. So there's all sorts of materials, and really make it available to different types of consumption based on someone's preference and how they like to consume their information.
Cool. I feel like we're just barely getting started, but our hour is just about up. We might have to do this again. What is one final piece of advice you can give to somebody who's feeling stuck today?
First of all, reach out to a support system. And I know that it doesn't really help people when you say you're not alone in this, because we tend to feel that we're alone and isolated. And yet this is a situation that is happening worldwide. So have a conversation and try to flip it. Look at one thing that you can learn, one thing that you can do differently to bring some joy into your life, and actually get up physically and move around. Because if you get up physically and move around, and not only that, but emotions, when we're in emotion, our head is going to be down. That's one of the reasons why kids smile all the time, because they got to look up. When you look up, you come out of the emotional part of your brain and you can smile again.
Nice. Very cool. Well, thank you for being here today. We may definitely have to have you back. This has been great. Dr. Karen Jacobson, thanks.
Thank you.
Make sure you head over to unstuckandhappy.com, where you'll find the video version of all of our podcasts, as well as information about upcoming Unstuck Happiness conferences and moving beyond personal development retreats. Those are amazing. Make sure you join us again next week for another great Unstuck story. And in the meantime, keep living unstuck and happy.